Hi, everyone. I'm Derek Chollet at GMF, and welcome to today's Books at GMF program. I'm very thrilled to be joined today by my good friend, John Judis, who's the author of the recent book, The Socialist Awakening, What's Different Now About the Left. And this is John's third book in the last 4 years that looks at the politics of our time and the various isms that have been so much in the news. This first book of this series 4 years ago was about populism. A few years ago, he joined us here at GMF to talk about nationalism. And today he's here to talk about socialism. And I highly recommend all of these books. We've been thrilled to have John join us to talk about the previous two. I'm really happy to have him here today. And before the program, we were talking, John and I were talking, and next year, all three will be republished as a single volume, revised and updated, entitled Politics in Our Time. John, is that right?
Yes.
Yes. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today and looking forward to rereading all these books packaged together because they're both, all these books, whether it's about populism, nationalism, or today's topic, socialism, are really interesting and insightful brief histories of these ideas and these concepts and some of the major figures that are associated with them, but then also, of course, very much about our current moment. And this book in particular on socialism is a really interesting history of the various strands of socialism and the debate in the United States and about socialism and how we ended up where we are today. But then it's also in many ways, and this is a little different from your previous two books, John, it's also kind of a call to arms. You're someone who has a lot of personal experience with socialist ideas, socialist movements, and many of the political figures that you talk about in the book. So it's also very much a personal story as well. So John, thanks for coming. It's great to see you. And John and I are going to talk for a while, but I very much encourage everyone to ask questions and use the Q&A in the Zoom to offer your questions, and I will fold those in to the conversation. But John, what I'd like to do is start off by giving you a chance to talk about how this book fits within this broader context that you've been working on for the last 4 years. And you could talk a little bit about populism and nationalism if you'd like, but how you see the socialist awakening fitting within this larger intellectual project you've been embarked on for the last several years.
Sure. Good to be with you again. I'm glad I'm not sick today. I was last time I nearly died.
That's right. I forgot. It was not COVID. It was pre-COVID times. It was
no, I know.
Just
I
a
know,
cold.
Completely lost my voice by the end. I started this project after I left being a staff member, first of the New Republic for many years of the National Journal. And all three, populism, nationalism, and socialism, are products, you could say, of the Great Recession and the disillusionment with a kind of, people call it neoliberalism, market fundamentalism, what have you. In the case of populism and nationalism, terrorism and immigration and the fusion of those two fit very much in to the picture, especially the right-wing varieties of both populism and nationalism. Socialism is, as I see it, it's not like the kind of socialism that I espoused when I was a operatic in the late 60s and early 70s. In two respects. First, in terms of popularity, I like to tell the story of how I was a member of a group called the New American Movement, which is a merge to form the Democratic Socialists of America, which is now the big socialist organization.
This was at Berkeley, right?
In the Bay Area. And our San Francisco chapter ran a candidate for the Board of Supervisors. And I think there were going to be 4 chosen. And she was not a bad candidate. I mean, she could talk and stuff like that. And she came in 16th. And the person who came in 15th was a guy named Jesus Christ Satan. So socialism at that point was not a popular cause. Now I think they have two people on the board of supervisors who were socialists and the district attorney. So it's things have changed, and they changed particularly among young people. And to somebody like me, it was just astonishing to see that happen. And the second thing is that the kind of socialism really is very different from the 60s Marxism or Marxist Leninism or Maoism and or a lot of those kind of nutty trends that popped up, especially in the late 60s. It's mainly comes out of a disillusionment with the kind of market capitalism rather than an attraction to a particular kind of socialism.
Mm-hmm.
Denmark, Sweden, again, it's to some extent liberalism and progressivism as an alternative to capitalism. So, you know, what you began to see even before Bernie Sanders ran in 2015 was you'd see these polls with astonishing results of, 48% of 18 to 29-year-olds had a favorable view of socialism. I mean, that for somebody like me who grew up in the Cold War years, that's amazing. So it's, again, socialism is coming back, but it's in a different kind of form. And a lot of policies and ideas that people think of now as socialist are espoused by people like Elizabeth Warren or Sherrod Brown, who don't call themselves socialists. So for me, the question is, in terms of America's future, are we going to get these kind of ideas, people before profits, creating the kind of social democracies that already exist to some extent in Europe, Australia, what have you, in the United States, where we really are behind them, and the extent that we're behind them has been dramatized by the pandemic and by the incredible holes in our safety net. So that's how I come to the subject.
So why now? I mean, is as you said, many populism, nationalism, and socialism in their modern forms are very much a manifestation of the Great Recession, probably also the impact of U.S. foreign policy, I would say, to a certain extent in the 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s. But I'd like to drill down a little more on that. I mean, why do you think this moment, not just in the last 6 months, obviously because of the pandemic and the economic crisis from that, but more broadly within the last decade, why do you think that all of a sudden it's getting traction in the way it has?
Well, again, I did the polls, these people, Data for Progress and YouGov gave me their raw data, and they gave me one of these gadgets that allowed me to do cross tabulations. The key group, again, are kids who went to college, but not professional, not, 4 years and that's it. Live in these metro centers. It's called post-industrial metro centers, not in Evansville, Indiana, but more likely in Boston, New York, Chicago, college towns, things like that. And the key events are the Great Recession, where they get out of college and suddenly find that they don't have the kind of opportunities they expected, and where they are saddled with enormous amounts of student debt. Climate change, which for this generation, and not for mine, for us, it was nuclear war in the 50s. I mean, we worried that the whole planet was going to go under, and every time we'd see a missile battery like they had on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, you drive by that, the chills would go down. I think for people growing up now, the fear of climate change is something very real, and it's something that they trace to an unregulated capitalism, in this case, the fossil fuel industry. So those two are big, have been the biggest factors, I think. And then Bernie Sanders, his presidential run, solidified the support and gave it some kind of real form. And now we have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There's a group of leaders. It's not a big group, and the socialism itself is somewhat amorphous. But that's where we're at now.
Well, later on, I want to get into the international dimension of this, but before I do. I'd like to go back to history a little bit, because this is one thing I found really
Okay.
interesting about your book. And you talk about, you trace the journey of socialism and socialist arguments in the United States going back to the early 20th century to the present, basically. And so, talk a little bit about Eugene Debs, because he's a focus of a good part of your book, and probably a name familiar to some of our listeners. Maybe others have never heard of him, but just why is he significant? And also, uh, uh, why did Debs fail? And then that can fast forward to Bernie Sanders, and to the extent that Sanders has succeeded. Of course, he didn't succeed in becoming the nominee for president either time he ran, but never. Your argument is that a lot of his ideas are being carried forward. So let's start with Debs, and then we can trace that forward to Sanders.
Okay.
Okay.
Debs from Terre Haute, Indiana, a union official, but at a time then unions themselves, some of the locomotive firemen didn't believe in strikes. Somebody who in the course of the late 19th century, when you had these incredible, call it a class war, battles between employers and workers, came to believe that not only did workers have to strike and organize, but that it would not be possible to change the system itself without workers taking over the means of production, factories and offices, and running it themselves. Because the key time was the Great Depression of the 1890s, from 1893 to 1897, when you had really huge amounts of unemployment and no safety net except for Civil War veterans. So that for Debs was the key time. And the two components of his socialism, one of which still exists, is the Christian part. I mean, he used to say that Jesus was more important than Marx to him, and he had in his jail cell, he didn't have in Atlanta when he was arrested for sedition during World War I. He had a photo of Jesus and not of Marx. The ideas about cooperation, altruism, the rejection of selfishness, the idea of equality, come out of the Sermon on the Mount as much as they come out of Das Kapital. So that was an important part, and that's still a very important part for people now who think of themselves as socialists. They might not think of themselves as Christian, but those ethical ideals are very important. Second is the Marxist part. Again, the idea that we have to socialize the means of production. And insofar as he was a socialist and the Socialist Party was dedicated to these ideas, it only really had its heyday in the early 20th century, when there wasn't a strong liberal or progressive force within the major parties. Really, 1912 is sort of the end, and that's when you have Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson running as progressives. And from that point on, socialism as a third party movement in America really isn't viable. And it becomes, I don't know, under Norman Thomas in the 1930s, they got 1% of the vote or something like that. So now really what it is, again, it's a movement. It's not a political party. And I think that in America, there really isn't much room for third parties, except at moments like the Civil War, when the country is just breaking apart and you have a major issue that nobody else will take seriously. Bernie Sanders comes out of the New Left, like I did. He goes to Vermont, more the hippy dippy part of the New Left. Free love, homeschooling, believe it or not, is a big thing for hippies and communes. But also Debs and Marx, and he runs as a third party candidate, and at his best, I think gets 6% as governor, and runs as an independent for the mayor of Burlington, and by a miracle from his standpoint wins by like 10 votes. And that's really the beginning of his political career. And he says, when interviewed, well, I'm not going to nationalize the banks. and things like that. I don't have the power to do that in Burlington, but he still believes in that. Sometime later, in 1989-90, when he's running for Congress the second time, he undergoes a real change. And I think it's partly due to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It wasn't an explicit idea for many of us, but I think we did sort of secretly believe that socialism would be Soviet central planning plus democracy. That's what it would look like.
Mm-hmm.
And the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think, just destroyed all those ideas that you could have a viable economy without private industry and without markets. So, again, it was a question of how to tame, regulate, take over industries that were completely intransigent, but, still private industry, still markets. And Bernie changes at that point. And he becomes the socialist that we know now. I mean, he described himself then as a Swedish-style socialist.
Mm-hmm.
Medicare for all,
Mm-hmm.
free college, campaign finance reform, all those kind of things that we now associate with him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when he takes off as a politician. And, his run for president, if this kind of process hadn't taken place among young people, he wouldn't have gotten anywhere. His vote in the primaries in 2016 among 18 to 29-year-olds totaled more than Clinton and Trump put together. That's his base.
Mm-hmm.
For older voters, 45 years, let's say, and older, who were raised during the Cold War and still associate even democratic socialism with the Soviet Union or Venezuela, he was a no-go.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'd say that too for older Black voters in particular, who are among the most realistic American voters, who really worry a lot about electability, and particularly this election worried about it. I mean, Bernie was a non-starter. They weren't going to take a chance on him for president. So again, I think he was a product of this enormous and for me, unforeseen upsurge among young Americans.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting, because one of the things I wanted to ask you about too was the relationship between the socialist arguments and figures and African American politics as well, because of course Bernie famously did not succeed in this primary race, and was unable to really garner much support from the Black community, and so what kind of talk about a little bit about like the role that race plays in socialism, if you want to expand it back out to populism and nationalism too.
Oh, Derek, you're muted.
Oh,
for me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Oh, now I can hear you.
Okay. Sorry.
The role that race plays in socialism.
Yeah. And just, in the role that, because of course, one of the, in terms of Sanders' own politics today, and I don't know obviously we were in a much different moment a century ago with Eugene Debs, but he could not garner much support among African Americans, and how the kind of the overlay of race on the socialist arguments.
Yeah, I think that was inconsequential. I think that was entirely because of the electability problems and the realistic being realistic about politics. I think that's the reason. When I came to Washington in 82. Well, I started covering Washington before that for In These Times, which was at the time a weekly, the Independent Socialist Weekly. The people I went to were John Conyers and Ron Dellums. And Ron Dellums started the Progressive Caucus with Bernie Sanders. He was a socialist, so was Conyers. So there is a tradition of socialism among Blacks, African Americans. This is not some alien idea. But again, I think in the case of Bernie, he did get some support among young African Americans, but the older voters were the same as older voters in Massachusetts, or who were not the African Americans or whatever, who, when the election started to turn after Biden showed he was viable, chose him over Sanders and Warren for that matter, on the grounds again that he was somebody who could beat Trump. I mean, this is a very unusual election. I think a lot of us are really panicked at the thought of four more years of Trump. And it's put that factor, it's dramatized that factor to an extent that I don't ever remember in my lifetime.
Well, mentioning Warren, where do you place Warren within this new socialism construct that you articulate? I mean, you focus on Sanders. You say that many of her ideas are consistent with these arguments, of course, but she describes herself as a capitalist. How do you see her fitting into this? Because you focus on Sherrod Brown and Sanders mainly in the book.
Yeah, we have in the United States, we have had a long tradition of anti-statism, skepticism about big government, skepticism about socialism and communism. A lot of what we call liberalism, of what the New Deal liberals called liberalism in the 30s, Roosevelt's famous Second New Deal during World War II, are very close to European social democracy. What we have now, and I describe in the book, as a kind of shadow socialism, where there are now a lot of publications, there are a lot of politicians who espouse the same ideas as, say, AOC or Bernie Sanders, but don't call themselves socialists. And from the standpoint of their political careers, rightly so, because it would just cause them unneeded grief. I think in the case of Bernie, he actually might have been happy calling himself a progressive. And he once told Colbert that in the right before the campaign started for presidency, but he's a stubborn guy. I mean, he always has been, and he's not gonna, he wasn't gonna change his views for the sake of winning votes. So I think in the United States, what we're seeing now, and especially at this time of the pandemic and the recession, where the kind of knee-jerk opposition to big government has to fall away. I mean, we have to have major government, and it comes a question of how and what's going to happen, whether it's going to be a left-wing version or a right-wing version. This kind of socialism and shadow socialism comes into play. And you have a lot of people who are espousing the very similar ideas, whether they call themselves socialists or not. I mean, there are 95 people in the Progressive Caucus of the House now. They endorse pretty much all of Sanders' agenda, and there'll be more after this election. And I'm not saying that that's going to be the dominant current in a Biden administration, but it's going to be part of American politics, I think, from now on.
Well, John, this builds on some questions we've gotten from our listeners about the terminology of socialism and the problematic terminology in terms of our politics today. And one listener's asks, why, in your view, why is this Red Scare politics still so prevalent? Even though we're 30 years after the end of the Cold War. A lot about socialism in this campaign, and we'll hear about it, I'm quite sure, tomorrow night in the next presidential debate. And so first, your diagnosis of why that politics still resonates, but then secondly, what are your ideas for how we might find different words to use to talk about some of these? Because as you say, there is a shadow socialism that's out there, but very few politicians want to identify themselves as socialist. So right. What ideas do you have to offer?
Well, why the negative view, I think, again, is due to the Cold War in those years, and the identification of the socialism with Soviet Union, the present experience of in China, as it turns, say, even totalitarian, isn't helping the cause of socialism or communism. For people who identify it with something that is undemocratic and that is autocratic. So that's the main reason that socialism is an objectionable term. And Trump is really not talking to young voters when he makes those kind of appeals. He's talking to the older voters who have been his core constituency. So,
Mm-hmm.
again, it's just I would never have even imagined writing this book 10 or 15 years ago. I didn't reconceive socialism. It happened among young people in America. And
Mm-hmm.
so now it's a question of whether, as we move forward, and as whether that those generations move up, whether when they become a majority of the electorate, people become more used to that word, because the connotation, part of the connotation is important. The social versus individual, the cooperation, the ethical ideas, I think, are conveyed by that in a way that aren't so much by a term like liberal or progressive. But I don't care, and we'll have to see. I don't know now what in 10 years how the left will describe itself in America. And it would be
Mm-hmm.
fine with me if it's not, if the term isn't socialist, if we find a new term. Social democratic is a big thing in Europe, but in America, it's only among academics who even use that term.
Right. Well, speaking of European democratic socialism, one of the things you do in this book, as you do in the Populism book and the Nationalism book, is you put an international lens on this topic, which I think is really interesting, and something that I think many in our audience can relate to. And so I'd like to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the British Labour Party, which is one of your focus which you focus on this book, and in particular also the journey of a certain Jeremy Corbyn, and his failure in the UK, but just also what and how that kind of reflects back on the debates we're having in the United States about socialism.
Yeah, Corbyn's a kind of difficult to talk about in the same way that Trump is, because he's sui generis. When I started the book, it was just after he had done the astonishingly well in the election against Theresa May, and you sort of had this idea that, well, there could be this, you could have this triumphant chapter about socialism in the UK. And then I went to the Labour conference in Brighton, and I found out a little more about what was happening in the Brexit stuff, and I became much more skeptical. The British party, it was not in the beginning a socialist party. It was a product of Christian ethics and labor, growth of labor, the labor movement there. Only became nominally socialist in 1918. But has remained so even under Tony Blair. That's part of its platform is socialist. So it's a question of how that's filled in. One of the things that I thought was important about the experience in Britain, and that has some application here, is that the role of nationalism. A lot of people, I think, in the British let's say in the parts of the British left, and in the same thing happens to the American left, associated Brexit with a desire to go back to the years of Imperial Britain. Just as Make America Great was interpreted, well, we want to go back to the Southern Confederacy. But there was a meaning that eluded, I think, the Corbyn, and that eluded the Hillary Clinton people. In Britain, nationalism referred, I think, really mainly to the period after World War II, when, to the surprise of many, the British themselves, they became self-sufficient in agriculture. They were a leading manufacturing power. Then in the 1980s, the country became really transformed during the Thatcher years, and in a way very similar to us. Finance, all the growth concentrated in the big cities, and particularly in London, and you had all these left behinds, the same way you do in the United States. Now in Britain, the left behinds were the core of the Labour Party.
Mm-hmm.
And even though maybe percentage-wise they weren't, they also were the core of any possible majority that the Labor Party could win. Corbyn had to kind of try to maneuver himself around that. And he wasn't that well fitted to do so, in part because he was a veteran of the New Left, the kind of anti-imperial New Left, skeptical about Britain itself as an imperial power. I think in that sense, he really didn't get it. He didn't get that, the sense in which there was a constructive nationalism at the heart of the Brexit appeal, as well as all the anti-immigrant or whatever. He missed that.
Mm-hmm.
When I went to the labor conference in Brighton, I was amazed to hear people denounce Britain as the country that started all the problems about climate change, because it was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, I couldn't believe what I was
Mm-hmm.
hearing.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't they proud about that aspect? So there was a kind of knee-jerk rejection of nationalism and of whatever spirit had motivated a lot of their supporters to support Brexit. And the complications were that they got completely messed up in their stance on it. They ended up supporting this thing called the People's Referendum, and they had basically an incoherent position on what to do. So that contributed to Corbyn's defeat. Keir Starmer, to my surprise, has completely turned around the policy and now has accepted that Brexit, and it's a question of how they're going to do it and
Mm-hmm.
what they're going to accomplish through it, and whether they're going to pay attention to these communities that have been left behind by financialization, by the concentration of wealth in London and those places. So
Mm-hmm.
that was the lesson I took from Corbyn's difficult.
It's really interesting, because then how to reflect that back to the U.S., because of course the way the debate about socialism plays out, say in the presidential campaign or in general politics, is to be socialist is to be un-American. It's not to believe in sort of the basic freedoms of the United States. And
I didn't even bring it around to Trump in 2016. So let me just start by saying that I think for a lot of the Clinton supporters, they saw the slogan "Make America Great" as something that's just whatever, racist, or the responsible Obama and Clinton, America is great. But for the generation that grew up after World War II, again, these were people that when you went into a store in the 1950s or 1960s, you looked for things that were made in America, not because you were a patriot, but because we made the best things. And there was this kind of traumatic experience that happened to those generations of older Americans who in 1980s realized, well, we don't make things anymore. They're made somewhere else. And they're made in Japan, and now they're made in China. And, again, this is an enormous issue now with the pandemic and where the pills are made, supply chains. And Trump got that. He got that, and the Democrats didn't get that. And again, that's an element of nationalism. It's an element for him that he could turn toxic because it's accompanied with all the hatred of Mexicans or what have you. But again, it's a positive part of nationalism, and the idea that, again, we have to protect our own industries. We have to see which industries are vital to the country and that we should produce here. Should be a part of liberalism, progressivism, socialism, as well as whatever comes out of Trump's "Make America Great Again" slogan. So that was the argument about nationalism.
But do you see those sort of espousing socialist politics or positions? I mean, how do you think they're doing in terms of connecting that to a certain idea of American nationalism here, or is that still, as you see it?
I think that, I think, especially if you talk about the left and not of, I think that Warren and Biden, the idea of economic patriotism, are really beginning to get it.
Yeah.
But in terms of what you hear from the people on the left or magazines, The Nation, The New Republic, and stuff like that, um, I think Trump has driven the left crazy to some extent.
Yeah.
And let's say on an issue like immigration, I mean, I'm entirely for the comprehensive reform, path to citizenship, but also border security. Also, a real determination who is a citizen and who should be eligible for
Hmm.
welfare payments or, Medicare for all or whatever. But I think somewhat in response to Trump, people have gone to these opposite extremes.
Hmm.
Open borders, abolish prisons and the police. I mean, I couldn't believe this. I mean, of course, reforms police departments. Would you want to abolish the police? I mean, what?
Right.
I live in
Right.
the suburbs. I mean, it just
Right. Right.
again. So I think that Trump has driven people a little crazy, and I'm hoping that if he is out of office and we have some kind of return to civility in the country and our politics, people will reconsider and adopt more reasonable positions on those kind of social issues.
Hmm. Well, getting back to this kind of the idea of kind of working class politics and socialism. It's interesting, socialism as an idea is associated with the working class, right? It's trying to
Right.
protect, everyday workers, right? And one of our listeners asked the question to you, and speaking to you as a socialist, as a self-identified socialist, your views on how the fact that the Democratic Party is mainly a coalition of highly educated whites and then people of color, and that's of course, as you argued in a book 20 some years ago, an emerging Democratic majority. We could talk a little bit about that if you'd like,
Right.
but nevertheless, the particularly the white working class is not part of this coalition, and and maybe that's changing. Maybe and it comes down, I think, going back to
Right.
race. I think it comes down to that, right? Because many of these sort of socialist ideas, whether it's healthcare or minimum wage or
Right.
strengthening the social safety net is obviously going to benefit folks who are hurt the most from this economic crisis we're in. But nevertheless, they still are supporting Trump.
Right.
So just kind of how you see that playing out.
Yeah, that's a big question, and don't go to extremes themselves in the formulation. The Democrats still, can win a majority of white working class. The pollsters define it as whites who have not graduated from
Yeah, not
four-year
right,
colleges,
right.
in some states. And when Rui and Teixeira and I were doing the book, we estimated that it have to be about 40%. But there's a paradox there, and you're absolutely right in thinking about socialism and socialist politics, which are based on the idea that you unite the middle and the bottom against the top. And again, I don't want to make invidious views of the top, but against the most wealthy and powerful, who at the moment have an inordinate control over our politics and our economy. And we're not doing that. And the Democrats aren't doing that. And there is a hole in the electorate. A lot of it has to do with the disintegration of the labor movement. In the 1950s, about a third of non-farm workers were in unions. What that meant was not just, organization at the workplace, but it was, again, a question of priorities. I always say myself that, all Americans are racist. I mean, we all have these kind of fears and stereotypes built into us, including Black people about themselves and white people. And it's a question of what ideas come to the fore. And one of the effects of having an organized working class in the 50s or 60s was that certain ideas took precedence over others. Certain economic considerations took precedence over others.
Mm-hmm.
If the Democrats are going to go to extremes on social issues, if they are going to talk about things like reparations, it's going to be impossible, or abolish the police. It's going to be impossible to win back at working class. But I would say that two things, that the Democrats and the left have to understand that on the cultural issues, they're really expressing a very narrow kind of interest that arises out of their own background, special backgrounds. And they have to do things to come to terms with how different the country is on cultural issues. And the second thing is that there has to be a revival of the labor movement and of organization from below, to give, again, this kind of broad coalition of interests so that we can unite around economic concerns and political concerns and not get distracted by very extreme social positions. So that's my 2 bits on the issue.
Okay. What?
So, I mean, just the one thing. So
Yeah.
for me, as I look at Biden, a Biden presidency, labor law reform, absolutely central, more important almost than anything else, than public option or whatever. Because the problem that with Obama was that he came in 2008, 2009 in January with a tremendous opportunity. You know, you had this need, you had to go big and all this stuff, but he didn't think about the politics. He didn't think enough about how to build a majority coalition that would keep the Democrats in power in 2010 and 2012 and on. And I think that key to that, again, is reviving the party from below.
Yeah, well, that's so. I want to drill down on this a bit because, of course, the knock on Sanders, we heard this in 2016, 20 primaries, was that he'd been in Washington all these years, calling for all this change, and he really never had accomplished much. And so, if you're imagining it's a Biden presidency, let's say the Democrats have the Senate, what's on the to-do list, and what do you believe is actually possible given the just the dysfunction right now of our politics to bring about any of this change? And of course, what's driving some of the discussion about filibuster reform or adding states to the union to enlarge the Senate is trying to find a way to address this fundamental kind of clog in our system.
Right. Well, I mean, there's two kinds of considerations. What's going to be necessary for Biden to craft legislation for Biden and the Democrats in Congress that will be in the public interest? I mean, we're going to have to do a lot of stuff with our healthcare system, also with transportation and energy. You know, how do you do that? And I think it's going to be very hard to do that without abolishing the filibuster. And also, I think that the Democrats are going to, you're going to take a chance because maybe the Republicans will come back in 2022 and 2024 and be able to have things their way. So it's risky, but that's again, I think that's central. As far as the future of the party, I mean, there's two things. You do things that will benefit people, that they'll look to as people look to Social Security. So, you shore up the healthcare system in a way that's obviously a benefit to people and where they don't think that they're going to be paying higher taxes to support somebody else who may not be working or whatever, the kind of complaints that were made about Obamacare. But secondly, again, I go back to the labor law reform. You try to do things that will help the Democrats build an organized base, because this social media stuff is not going to work as a permanent way of reorienting our politics. I mean, we saw that with the Arab Spring. I mean, that was the telltale example. And much of the politics of the left now takes that kind of anarchic form instead of, the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, his leadership, absolutely central. That one organization. You really had two. You had SNCC and you had the Southern Christian Leadership. Black Lives Matter, completely decentralized group. One group is completely different from the other. The kind of protests that occurred over the summer and spring, again, some of which discredited the cause they claimed to be acting on behalf of. You have to have an organized movement from below. So again, I think that the Biden people have to be thinking of that. And the way that they can do it is through changing the labor laws. Gig workers, are they going to be, you're going to be able to organize them? And they're going to have to fight the Supreme Court on that too, I suspect.
Yeah, it's interesting. Perhaps in the revised edition of the book, as you're bringing populism, nationalism, and socialism together, lessons from the new left in terms of both successes from the '60s, but also the failures, as we saw that come to an end at the late '60s, early '70s, would be interesting to apply to today. One question that's come in, John, from a viewer. It goes to an issue that I know you've thought a lot about as it relates to your earlier books, and it's related to this one, is the impact of immigration on these debates, particularly populism and nationalism, but also on the debates about socialism. And also it's partly about who gets to be part of this policy space, right? In terms of who can benefit. So give some thoughts about how that issue impacts the way we talk about socialist ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important. And I referred to that when I was talking about how Trump has driven us crazy on that issue with him and the wall and the, Mexican rapists and all that stuff. I think has validated the views on the other extreme that we should just have open borders and not care who comes into the country or have citizenship requirements. I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding of immigration and its effect on the American labor force and on the left and on progressivism. The changes in our immigration law in 1965, when we got rid of the quotas that discriminated against the Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans, were absolutely necessary. But what happened over the next 50 or 60 years was that we had an enormous increase in unskilled workers, particularly from the south of us, just at a time when African Americans had finally won their civil rights and were coming into the labor force, and they created a kind of surplus below. If you put that together with deindustrialization, and that, I think that's a lot of the reason for the continuing problems we have with an underclass in America that's composed partly of new immigrants, unskilled, but partly also of African Americans. So I think that's not well understood, and it's a reason again for thinking about that in terms of how we reform immigration. We have to find a way to integrate the undocumented, unauthorized, illegal immigrants into our society. Again, path to citizenship. But we again have to gear our immigration policy so we don't have these incredible labor surpluses from below that bring down wages and make it impossible to organize those people into unions. So that's the way I think about immigration, but it's not the way that, for the most part, Democrats think about immigration.
So we've just got a few minutes left, and I want to encourage, if anyone has a last question, please ask it. But one in the meantime, what I'd like to ask you about is a writer in a book that you reference that it's very much shaped your thinking on socialism. It's Karl Polanyi, and it's the 1944 book, The Great Transformation. And I noted, John, in your I think it was in the acknowledgments or at some point in the book, you said you had read the book years ago and it didn't make much of an impact on you, and you'd since reread it and it has had a huge impact on your thinking. I could relate to that because I too read the book 20 some years ago in graduate school. It kind of bounced off my head. I don't know that I understood it fully. But so I was very curious to read about your journey with this book and the importance of his thinking on you. So if you could just talk a little bit about first who Karl Polanyi was, why the book mattered, and then how it's changed your thinking.
Yeah, he was an Austro-Hungarian socialist who emigrated first to the UK. He was Jewish, though he became a Christian, And he had to flee Austria when the Nazis became powerful, and wrote the Great Transformation, I think in 1943 and 44 during World War II, when he was at Bennington, when he was teaching at Bennington. And what stopped me initially, and I bet stopped you, is there's a 300 pages on a discussion of the poor laws in Britain, extraordinarily detailed. But then when you get to the conclusion, what he draws from that is our lessons about what happened in the 1920s and the 1930s in Europe and the United States, which is that those countries reached a kind of crossroads where the kind of capitalism, international capitalism and domestic policy, the gold standard, laissez-faire capitalism, were found not to work, and where the countries had to go in some other direction. They had to embrace, to some extent, big government. And they went to the right in Central Europe and Southern Europe toward fascism and Nazism. And the United States, they went to the left, to the New Deal. And what got me as I read it this time was, we're in a very similar situation now. We're at a kind of crossroads. We've had the Great Recession. Now we have an even greater recession plus the pandemic. We're going to have to change we're going to have to do big government in that sense. I mean, we already had it was a $2 trillion CARES Act. That was inconceivable again 10 or 20 years, and Republicans voting for it. So the question is, are we going to go to the left as the United States did, or are we going to go to the right as Germany and Italy did? And I think we're facing very similar choices, though. Again, we're not facing the Nazis on the right. So that's what I took from. That's the lesson I took from Polanyi's book.
Right.
He also, I think, at the time saw the New Deal as a kind of proto-socialism. So again, I think that fits the Sanders conversion in 1990 and the way that young people are thinking of socialism now.
Well, you've inspired me and hopefully others to go back and give the book another shot. And maybe you're right. Maybe skip over the long discussion of British laws and skip to the end, maybe. So just a couple last questions going out, John. You've been, as you say in the book, and we've talked about today, you've been engaging with socialist ideas going back to before college, before you were at Berkeley. How did writing this book and thinking about it more deeply over the last year or so change your thinking? I mean, is there anything that you rediscovered Polanyi? Anything else that
my thinking changed earlier? It changed in the late 70s and
how about
early
talk
1980s.
a little bit about that? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the key event for me was I was a leader of this group called the New American Movement, and Tom Hayden was running for Senate in 1976 against John Tunney, and we had a meeting of all the
California. This is in California.
This is in California. I was living in Oakland, and we had a meeting of all the California chapters. So it was about 1,000 people. I can't remember. And it was we had it in Oakland, and we were debating whether to support this guy. Now you have to go back again to thinking about this: the Democratic primary. So some people didn't want to support him because he was a Democrat, and Democrats are capitalists. Some people didn't think we should participate in elections at all. Others, like myself, thought we should support him. We should get into electoral politics. That should be a central idea of socialism. So the debate went back and forth, and finally someone got up from the Los Angeles chapter and gave this ringing argument why we should support Hayden. And the central part of her speech, the climax, were quotations from Lenin's State and Revolution. And that won the day. And I said to myself, I'm in a parallel universe here. Right. It's science fiction. I have to get out of this stuff. And that's that really was the end of my career as a professional revolutionary, right? I became a journalist because as a journalist, you have to, talk to people who are different from you and don't live in Berkeley or,
Right.
wherever.
Right.
So, and at that point too, I think I began to try to figure out what socialism really meant, and I realized that it was for me a kind of religious conviction. It was a kind of my own secular version of millennialism. It was it was heaven at the end of the travails of living on earth. Um, Again, I started to think more specifically about what it could mean. And I only really in the 1990s started to get upon these ideas, as did other people that I cite in the book, that socialism could be something that developed within capitalism, the way that capitalism itself developed within feudalism. So that, that was the period in which my ideas changed. And this book gave me an opportunity to write about them.
Well, John, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I'm really glad you had the opportunity to write about these ideas because it's a terrific book. It's 100 and just 100. So it's a quick read. It's a lively read. You get a lot of great history. You get a lot of commentary on the current political moment. So I highly recommend it, as well as your previous two books over the last 4 years on populism and nationalism. So I buy them all now and read them, and then you can also get the revised hardcover when it's out next year. John, thanks a lot for writing this book, The Socialist Awakening. Thanks for being with us here this morning, and I'll look forward to seeing you again soon. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and thanks for your great questions as well. We'll be posting this on YouTube later, so for those of you who missed part of it, you can rewatch it. Otherwise, John, thanks again. Have a terrific day, everyone, and please stay safe.
My pleasure.
All right. So long. Bye-bye.